What if the lights went out, not all at once, but slowly, over generations, in different places, for different reasons, yet somehow at the same time? What if the greatest cities of the ancient world didn't burn in a single night, but simply grew quieter year by year until the scribes stopped writing, the merchants stopped coming, and the stone plazas fell silent under accumulating dust? What if collapse wasn't an ending at all, but a transformation so gradual that those living through it couldn't name the moment when everything changed? Across the world, in different centuries, the signs repeat. A capital grows quiet, trade routes thin, records become fragmentary, then stop altogether. The night feels a little wider, a little less contained by walls and torches. Not a single catastrophe, not one volcanic winter or plague or invasion, but many small pressures aligning, like tumblers in a lock clicking into place. Tonight, we follow those pressures. We watch complex worlds slowly change shape. We ask what happens when the systems that hold civilizations together begin, almost imperceptibly, to unravel. The story begins not with fire, but with silence. Imagine standing in a plaza that once held thousands. The stones are still warm from the afternoon sun. Vendor stalls line the edges, but fewer than before. The crowds are thinner. The goods on display are simpler, more local. There's no incense from distant mountains, no dyed cloth from coastal cities 3 weeks' journey away. The officials still wear their regalia, still perform the old ceremonies, but the treasury is smaller, the workforce harder to gather. No one announces that the world is ending. Life continues. Children play. Farmers plant. But the hum, the density, the layered complexity of a thriving capital has begun to fade. This is not one city. This is a pattern. In the eastern Mediterranean, around 1200 years before the Common Era, palace centers across a vast network begin to falter. In the Maya lowlands, between the 8th and 9th centuries of the Common Era, inscriptions cease at site after site. In the highlands of the Andes, around the year 1000, vast ceremonial complexes are gradually abandoned. In the western provinces of Rome, between the 4th and 6th centuries, urban life contracts, currency systems collapse, and literacy becomes rare. In mainland Southeast Asia, the hydraulic empire centered at Angkor begins a long, slow retreat in the 14th and 15th centuries. Different times, different places, different cultures, languages, technology, belief systems. And yet, when we look closely, the rhythms are similar. The sequence of symptoms is familiar. Complexity, which had been a society's strength, becomes its vulnerability. Networks that once carried wealth and knowledge become conduits for instability. The very systems that allowed people to build cities, armies, and archives also made them dependent on things they could not fully control. Distant harvests, faraway mines, trade partners who might stop sending grain or copper or soldiers. Tonight, we walk slowly through these moments of transition. We do not seek a single explanation. We do not claim that all collapses are the same. But we do observe that certain pressures, when they arrive together, can push even the most impressive societies toward profound change. Climate instability, trade disruption, warfare that drains resources without clear resolution. Political overreach, where the cost of administration exceeds what the population can support. Disease, quietly reducing labor forces and weakening institutions from within. These pressures do not need to be catastrophic individually. They need only to arrive in the same window of time. When they do, societies adapt, reorganize, simplify, and sometimes the complexity that once defined them fades into something quieter, something that leaves fewer traces in the archaeological record. Let us begin with the idea of a network. A civilization is not a single city or a single people. It is a web of relationships, trade routes that carry tin and copper to bronze working centers, scribes who record taxes, treaties, and harvest yields, artisans who specialize in pottery, metalwork, weaving, each depending on others for food and raw materials, farmers who produce surpluses to feed non-farming specialists, elites who coordinate labor, redistribute resources, and claim the right to rule through ideology, lineage, or force. Religious institutions that legitimize authority and unify populations across distances. When this web is strong, the benefits are extraordinary. Cities can grow large. Monuments can be built. Armies can be fielded. Knowledge can be preserved in written form. A merchant in a coastal city can obtain obsidian from a volcanic highland, cedar from a mountain forest, lapis lazuli from a distant desert, all without leaving home. A scribe can read documents written 100 years earlier. A farmer can pay taxes in grain and receive protection from invaders. But networks are fragile. They depend on stability, on predictability, on trust that the next caravan will arrive, that the next harvest will be sufficient, that the next king will honor old agreements. When that predictability breaks, the network begins to contract. Perhaps the rains fail. Not every year, but often enough that harvests become unreliable. Granaries that once held 3 years surplus now hold 6 months. Officials raise taxes to compensate, putting pressure on farmers who are already struggling. Discontent spreads. Outlying regions stop sending tribute. Trade partners, facing their own difficulties, reduce shipments or demand higher prices. Perhaps a war begins. Not a quick conquest, but a grinding, multi-generational conflict that drains treasuries and pulls labor away from fields and workshops. Soldiers need to be fed, equipped, replaced. Fortifications need to be built and maintained. The wealth that once funded temples and palaces now funds armies. The scribes who once recorded poetry and history now record troop movements and ration distributions. Perhaps a disease arrives. Quietly, without the dramatic collapse of a sudden epidemic, just a background hum of higher mortality, fewer children surviving to adulthood, fewer workers available for the fields and construction projects. The population does not vanish, but it thins, and with fewer hands, the maintenance of roads, canals, terraces, and public buildings becomes harder. Things begin to decay. None of these pressures alone might be enough, but together they compound. Trade becomes more expensive, so specialized goods disappear from markets. Without those goods, certain crafts decline. Without those crafts, the artisans move away or return to farming. Without the artisans, the cities lose population. Without the population, the tax base shrinks. Without the taxes, the administration cannot function. Without the administration, the scribes are not paid. Without the scribes, the records stop. And without the records, we lose the thread of the story. This is what we see in the archaeological record. Not the collapse itself, but its shadow. Layers of ash and destruction are rare. What is common is silence. A pottery style that suddenly becomes less elaborate. Imported goods that disappear from grave assemblages. Monumental construction that ceases partway through. Inscriptions that stop dating events. Cities that do not burn, but simply shrink. Their outer neighborhoods gradually abandoned. Their central temples maintained by smaller and smaller groups until, eventually, even the core is left to the weather. The people do not vanish, but the systems that organized them, that recorded them, that made them visible to us across millennia, those systems fade. And when they fade, they often fade at similar times. across unconnected regions because the pressures that stress complex societies, climate shifts, resource competition, epidemic disease, political instability, these pressures are not purely local. They ripple across continents. They move with trade routes, with migration, with the slow planetary rhythms of drought and cooling and shifting monsoons. Let us now turn to the first pattern, the first alignment of pressures, the first moment when multiple worlds, seemingly independent, began to change shape at the same time. The Late Bronze Age, the Eastern Mediterranean, roughly 1,200 years before the Common Era. This was a world of palaces, not small fortresses, but sprawling administrative complexes that controlled vast territories. Mycenaean Greece, Hittite Anatolia, the kingdoms of the Levantine coast, Egypt's New Kingdom, Cyprus with its copper mines, Crete recovering from earlier disruptions. These were literate societies. They kept records, they wrote letters to each other, they traded extensively. Grain from Egypt, copper from Cyprus, tin from sources that remain, debated, possibly as far as Afghanistan, cedar from Lebanon, purple dye from coastal cities, perfumes, oils, weapons, pottery, luxury goods flowing along maritime and overland routes. The palaces organized this trade. They employed scribes who used Linear B in Greece, cuneiform in Anatolia and the Levant, hieroglyphics in Egypt. They built ships, maintained roads, stored grain, funded artisans. The archaeological record from this period is rich. We find bronze weapons in graves, fine pottery in settlements, clay tablets in palace archives. The tablets record rations, textile production, troop deployments, offerings to gods. They give us names of officials, lists of workers, inventories of goods. And then, within the span of a few generations, much of this world contracts. Mycenaean palaces are destroyed or abandoned. The script disappears. Monumental building stops. Long-distance trade collapses. Population estimates drop. Sites that once held thousands now hold hundreds or are left empty. The Hittite capital, Hattusa, is abandoned. Coastal cities in the Levant are burned or depopulated. Cyprus suffers widespread destruction. Egypt survives, but its empire shrinks, and it faces invasions from groups the texts call the Sea Peoples, a term that may describe displaced populations, raiders, or migrants fleeing instability elsewhere. This is often called the Bronze Age collapse. The name suggests suddenness, a singular event, but the changes unfold over decades, perhaps a century. Different regions experience different sequences. Some sites are destroyed by fire, others are not. Some populations disappear from the record, others relocate or merge with new groups. The timeline is blurry, the causes debated. What is clear is that the network broke. We do not know why with certainty. The written records do not explain their own ending. The last tablets at Pylos, one of the Mycenaean centers, record preparations for defense, deployments of troops to coastal watch stations, then silence. The palace burns. The tablets, preserved by the fire that destroyed the building, give us a snapshot of a system under stress, but not the nature of the threat. Theories abound. Earthquake storms, multiple quakes in close succession destabilizing entire regions. Climate change, a shift toward drier conditions that reduced agricultural yields. Systems collapse, where the complexity of palace economies became unsustainable. Invasions by seaborne raiders, though whether these groups were cause or symptom remains unclear. Internal revolts, with populations rebelling against the heavy demands of palace administration. Likely, it was all of these, in different proportions, in different places. Consider climate. Paleoclimate data suggests a period of increased aridity in the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BCE. Droughts become more frequent. Harvests fail more often. Palaces depend on agricultural surplus to feed their non-farming populations. Scribes, soldiers, artisans, priests. When surplus shrinks, the palace must make choices. Reduce rations, demand more from farmers, import grain from elsewhere. But if the drought is regional, imports become difficult. Trade partners face their own shortages. Prices rise, and the palace's ability to maintain its labor force weakens. Consider warfare. Tablets from the Hittite archives mention conflicts with groups to the west and south. Egyptian records describe battles with sea peoples. Mycenaean sites show evidence of fortification building in the final decades before their destruction. Warfare is expensive. It pulls labor from fields. It consumes stored resources. If a war drags on without resolution, the costs accumulate. And if multiple states are fighting simultaneously, trade routes become unsafe, further disrupting the networks that hold the system together. Consider trade. Bronze is an alloy, copper and tin. Copper was relatively abundant, mined in Cyprus and elsewhere. Tin was rare, sourced from distant regions, possibly Central Asia, possibly Iberia. The routes are still debated. If tin supplies were disrupted, bronze production would suffer. Weapons, tools, and ritual objects all depended on bronze. A shortage would affect military capacity, craft production, and the symbolic economy of elite power. Trade disruptions could cascade. Fewer goods moving meant fewer opportunities for the merchant and artisan classes. Economies contracted. Populations moved, seeking stability elsewhere. Consider disease. We have no clear evidence of a pandemic in the late Bronze Age, but absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Diseases leave few traces in the archaeological record unless they kill so many people that mass graves are needed, or unless they happen to be mentioned in texts. A disease that reduced populations by 10 or 20% over several decades would be invisible to us, but its effects on labor availability, military capacity, and social cohesion could be profound. The pressures compound. A drought reduces harvests. The palace raises taxes to compensate. Farmers, already struggling, cannot pay. Some abandon their land, moving to the hills or to other regions. The palace's tax base shrinks. Trade declines because there is less surplus to trade. Artisans and scribes lose employment. The palace can no longer maintain its administrative apparatus. Literacy declines. Writing becomes less common, then rare, then ceases. And without writing, the palace's ability to organize, to record, to command at a distance, disappears. In Mycenaean Greece, this happens at multiple centers within a generation or two. Pylos, Mycenae, Tiryns, Thebes. Some are destroyed by fire, others are abandoned. The population does not disappear, but it disperses. Settlements become smaller, simpler. Pottery styles become less elaborate. There is less evidence of long-distance trade, fewer exotic goods in graves. Iron begins to replace bronze, not because iron is better. Initially, it is softer, harder to work, but because iron ore is more abundant and does not require long-distance trade networks to obtain. The so-called Greek Dark Ages follow. Not dark in the sense of barbarism or ignorance, but dark to us because the written record vanishes. For several centuries, we have no texts. The oral tradition preserves stories that will eventually become the Iliad and the Odyssey, but the scribal class is gone. When writing returns to Greece, it is a new script, the alphabet, borrowed and adapted from Phoenician traders. The palace economies do not return. Political organization shifts toward smaller, more independent communities. This is transformation, not extinction. In Anatolia, the Hittite Empire fragments. The capital is abandoned. The great kings who corresponded with Egyptian pharaohs are gone. But Hittite culture does not vanish. It continues in smaller successor states in southern Anatolia and Syria, where inscriptions in Luwian, a related language, are carved into stone for centuries. The empire's collapse did not erase the people or their traditions. It ended a particular form of political organization. In Egypt, the new kingdom survives, but it is weakened. The 20th dynasty faces invasions from the Sea Peoples, groups whose origins remain uncertain. Egyptian texts describe battles on land and sea, victories claimed by the pharaoh, but also evidence of disruption. Settlements on the coast are damaged. Trade networks are disrupted. Egypt's control over its Levantine territories weakens. Subsequent dynasties are shorter, less powerful. The empire never fully recovers its earlier reach. In the Levant, coastal cities suffer. Ugarit, a prosperous port, is destroyed and never reoccupied. Its tablets, preserved in the final destruction layer, include letters requesting military aid, descriptions of enemy ships off the coast, a sense of urgent fear. Other cities, Byblos, Tyre, Sidon, survive, but the political landscape changes. The old palace systems fade. Phoenician city-states emerge, more focused on maritime trade than territorial control. In Cyprus, widespread destruction at the end of the Bronze Age is followed by a period of rebuilding. The island's copper mines remain important and trade continues, but the archaeological record shows a break. New pottery styles appear, possibly brought by migrants from the Greek mainland. The continuity is cultural, not political. This is the pattern we see. Not one collapse, but many, each with local particularities, yet all occurring within a narrow window of time. The systems that connected these regions, the trade, the diplomacy, the shared technologies, all of this begins to break down together. And when the network breaks, the nodes, the individual centers, cannot sustain their complexity alone. The Bronze Age collapse is not a mystery because we lack evidence. It is a mystery because the evidence points in multiple directions. Climate, warfare, trade, disruption, political instability, possibly disease, possibly internal revolt. All of these were happening. Disentangling cause and effect is difficult. Did climate change cause migrations that caused warfare that disrupted trade? Or did warfare disrupt trade, which caused economic decline, which made societies more vulnerable to climate stress? Or did internal weaknesses, overextended palace economies, make societies fragile so that any external shock could cause collapse? Probably there is no single answer. Probably the answer is different for each region. What is consistent is the outcome. Complexity declines. Writing fades. Long-distance networks contract. Populations reorganize into smaller, more local units. The archaeological record becomes sparser, not because people vanished, but because they no longer lived in ways that left dense material traces. They built less with stone, wrote less, traded less. They adapted. And in time, new forms of complexity would emerge. The Greek city-states, the Phoenician merchant networks, the Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian empires, Iron Age kingdoms in Anatolia and the Levant. The Bronze Age collapse was not the end of civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean. It was the end of a particular configuration. The people endured, they changed, they rebuilt. But for generations, there was silence. And the memory of the palace economies faded into legend, preserved in oral tradition as a lost age of heroes, great kings, and distant wars. Let us now move forward in time and across the ocean, to Mesoamerica, to the Maya lowlands, to another moment when complexity slowly unraveled, when the scribes stopped writing, when the cities grew quiet, and when the explanations, once again, are layered and uncertain. The classic Maya period, roughly from the 3rd to the 9th century CE, was a time of extraordinary cultural achievement. Cities with tens of thousands of inhabitants, pyramids and temples covered in plaster and paint, stelae carved with intricate glyphs recording the deeds of kings and queens, their births, marriages, wars, deaths. Elaborate calendrical systems tracking cycles of time with astronomical precision. A fully developed writing system, one of only a few independent inventions of writing in human history. Long-distance trade networks bringing jade, obsidian, cacao, feathers, shells, and other valued goods across the lowlands and highlands. The cities were politically independent, each ruled by its own dynasty, but connected by marriage alliances, trade, and frequent warfare. The inscriptions name kings with poetic titles: Great Sun Lord, Holy Lord of such and such, he of 20 captives. They record battles, captures, sacrifices. They track the movements of planets and the completion of calendrical cycles. They are intensely focused on royal legitimacy, on the divine right of rulers to command. And then, between the late 8th and early 10th centuries, at site after site, the inscriptions stop, not everywhere at once, not in a single catastrophic moment, but in sequence, as spreading across the lowlands like a slow wave. Certain cities continue for decades after others fall silent. Some regions see a collapse of political authority, but continued habitation at lower population levels. Other regions are abandoned entirely. The cities left to the forest. By the end of the 9th century, the great centers of the southern lowlands, Tikal, Calakmul, Palenque, Copan, many others, have ceased erecting dated monuments. The last known long count date at Tikal is 869 CE, at Copan 822 CE. New construction stops, the royal courts disappear, the population declines sharply. In some areas, it drops by 80 or 90%. This is often called the classic Maya collapse. And like the Bronze Age collapse, the name is both useful and misleading. Useful because something profound did happen. Misleading because the Maya did not disappear. Maya culture continued in the northern lowlands in the Yucatan, where cities like Chichen Itza and Uxmal flourished for centuries after the southern collapse. Maya people continued to live in the region, though in smaller numbers and with less political centralization. And the Maya are still here, millions of people speaking Maya languages and maintaining cultural continuity. But the political systems of the classic period, the god kings, the monumental architecture, the hieroglyphic inscriptions, these did fade. And the question is why? Again, the explanations are multiple, debated, and likely overlapping. Climate change is a leading candidate. Paleoclimate data from lake sediments, cave formations, and other sources show evidence of prolonged droughts in the Maya lowlands during the terminal classic period, roughly 800 to 1000 CE. Not one drought, but a series, separated by brief wet intervals. Each drought would have stressed agricultural systems. The Maya practiced swidden agriculture, slash-and-burn farming, which works well in a rainforest environment but depends on adequate rainfall. They also built reservoirs, terraces, and other water management systems, showing they understood the importance of water. But if droughts were severe and prolonged, even these systems might fail. A drought does not immediately end a civilization. Stored food can carry a population through 1 or 2 bad years. But if droughts become frequent, if the recovery periods are too short to rebuild reserves, then the pressure accumulates. Granaries empty. Elites must make hard choices. reduce the workforce on construction projects, cut rations to the military, demand more from farmers who are already suffering. Social tension rises, authority weakens, warfare intensifies during the Terminal Classic. The inscriptions from this period, those that remain, record more battles, more captives, more destruction. Kings compete for increasingly scarce resources. Alliances shift. Long-standing dynasties weaken. Some scholars suggest that the political system itself became unsustainable, that the ideology of divine kingship required constant displays of power, constant construction projects, constant warfare, and that this placed ever greater demands on populations already stressed by environmental and economic pressures. Consider the labor required to maintain a classic Maya city. The temples and pyramids needed periodic resurfacing with fresh plaster. The plazas needed sweeping and maintenance. The reservoirs and agricultural terraces required cleaning and repair. The royal court needed feeding not just the king and his immediate family, but scribes, artists, priests, administrators, warriors, servants, a large non-farming population dependent on the surplus produced by rural farmers. If that surplus declined, the whole system became harder to sustain. And unlike centralized empires with strong administrative control, Maya cities were independent polities, often at war with each other. There was no overarching authority to redistribute resources during a crisis. If one city suffered a drought, it could not rely on aid from neighbors. It might instead face invasion from neighbors, seeking to take advantage of weakness. This competitive political landscape may have made the Maya more vulnerable to systemic collapse. When stress arrived, cooperation was difficult. Conflict was the default response. Trade networks also show signs of disruption. Obsidian, which was sourced from highland Guatemala and central Mexico, becomes less common at southern lowland sites during the Terminal Classic. Jade and other long-distance goods also decline. This suggests that the networks which had carried these materials were breaking down. Perhaps the routes became unsafe due to warfare. Perhaps the trading partners in other regions were facing their own difficulties. Perhaps the southern lowland cities simply lacked the surplus to exchange for these goods. Population movements also played a role. Some evidence suggests migration from the southern lowlands toward the northern Yucatan and toward highland areas. The north had different environmental conditions, access to cenotes, natural sinkholes that provided reliable water even during droughts. Cities there continued to thrive after the southern collapse, absorbing refugees, developing new political systems, blending Maya traditions with influences from central Mexico. Disease is another possible factor, though direct evidence is limited. The dense populations of classic Maya cities would have been vulnerable to epidemics. Malnutrition caused by repeated harvest failures would have weakened immune systems. Trade networks, which carried goods, also carried pathogens. A disease that spread through the lowlands during a period of drought and warfare could have significantly reduced populations, making it even harder to maintain complex political systems. Environmental degradation may have compounded the climate stress. Centuries of intensive farming, deforestation for construction and fuel, and urban expansion could have degraded soils and reduced agricultural productivity. When droughts arrived, degraded landscapes would have been less resilient. The Maya may have pushed their environment to its limits during the Classic period, and when climate shifted unfavorably, those limits were exceeded. But we must be careful not to impose a narrative of inevitable decline. The Maya were sophisticated, adaptable people. They had survived environmental challenges before. They had rebuilt after droughts and wars. The Classic collapse was not preordained. It was the result of specific historical circumstances, a convergence of pressures that happened to align during a particular century. At Tikal, one of the greatest Maya cities, the final dated stela was erected in 869 CE. But the city did not empty immediately. People continued to live there for decades, perhaps centuries, though in smaller numbers and without the centralized royal authority. They stopped building pyramids and carving monuments, but they maintained homes, grew food, practiced their beliefs. Eventually, the site was largely abandoned, though exactly when and why remains unclear. The forest reclaimed the plazas. The temples, built to last forever, slowly weathered. And the silence spread. At Copan, in what is now Honduras, the last known royal monument dates to 822 CE. The inscriptions had recorded a dynasty stretching back centuries, kings with names like Smoke Imix and 18 Rabbit, rulers who claimed descent from gods and who built some of the most beautiful sculpture and architecture in the Maya world. But by the mid-9th century, the dynasty ends. The inscriptions stop. Construction halts partway through. The royal court dissolves. The population declines sharply from perhaps 20,000 to a few thousand within a generation or two. Recent excavations at Copan have found evidence of environmental stress. The valley's soils show signs of erosion and degradation. The forests had been cleared for agriculture and construction. The river, which had been a source of water and a boundary marker, may have flooded more erratically as deforestation reduced the land's ability to absorb rainfall. The city's elite, once wealthy and powerful, were buried in simpler graves toward the end, with fewer offerings, less jade, less elaborate pottery. Their funerary practices suggest declining resources, declining status, a loss of the surplus that had once supported their lifestyle. The people of Copan did not disappear. Many likely moved to the surrounding countryside or to other regions. The valley continued to be inhabited at lower population levels, but the political and cultural system that had defined the classic period was gone. At Palenque, in the western Maya region, the last dated inscription is from 799 CE, though the site may have remained occupied slightly longer. Palenque was known for its exquisite art, its delicate stucco, reliefs, its intimate scale compared to the massive pyramids of Tikal. The inscriptions told dynastic histories, recorded astronomical events, celebrated the achievements of rulers like Pakal the Great, whose tomb, discovered deep within the Temple of Inscriptions, remains one of the most famous archaeological finds in the Americas. But Palenque, too, fell silent. The temples were gradually abandoned. The city's location, nestled against forested hills, with streams running through it, meant that it was quickly overgrown. By the time Spanish explorers encountered the ruins centuries later, the jungle had claimed most of the site. The collapse was not uniform. Some cities in the northern Yucatan, as mentioned, continued to flourish. Chichen Itza, Uxmal, and other sites show evidence of continued or even increased activity during the Terminal Classic and into the post-Classic period. The northern cities adapted. They developed new architectural styles, incorporating influences from central Mexico. They maintained trade networks. They shifted religious practices with evidence of increased emphasis on rain gods and water symbolism, perhaps reflecting the environmental challenges of the time. The northern Maya did not collapse in the same way the southern cities did. They transformed, but they endured. This geographic variation is important. It suggests that the collapse was not caused by a single universal catastrophe. It was the result of local and regional factors that played out differently in different places. The southern lowlands, with their reliance on rainfall agriculture, their dense populations, their competitive political landscape, were more vulnerable than the north. When stress arrived, they could not adapt quickly enough. The north, with different resources and different political structures, weathered the same period more successfully. The Maya collapse teaches us that complexity is fragile. The classic Maya had built one of the most sophisticated civilizations of the ancient world. They had writing, mathematics, astronomy, art, architecture, all at levels that rivaled or exceeded their contemporaries elsewhere. But all of this rested on agricultural surplus, on the ability of farmers to produce more than they needed for themselves, to feed the scribes and artists and priests and kings. When that surplus declined, when droughts and warfare and environmental degradation made farming harder, the entire structure was at risk. And when the structure collapsed, it collapsed from the top down. The elites, who had the most to lose and the most mobility, left first. They stopped commissioning monuments. They stopped building temples. They may have moved to other cities or retired to rural estates. The scribes, who depended on elite patronage, lost their employment. Writing ceased. The administrative apparatus dissolved. And without the elites and scribes, the cities lost their purpose. They were no longer centers of power and culture. They became simply large villages, and eventually, even that was too much. The population dispersed. But the farmers, the people who had always lived on the land, growing maize and beans and squash, they continued. They did not need the cities. The cities needed them. And when the cities fell, rural life went on, quieter, simpler, but continuous. Let us now shift continents once more, to Southeast Asia, to the Khmer Empire, to the city of Angkor, the largest pre-industrial urban complex in the world, a city that covered hundreds of square kilometers, a city built around water, and a city that, like the Maya capitals, grew quiet and was gradually abandoned. Angkor, located in what is now Cambodia, was the heart of the Khmer Empire from the 9th to the 15th centuries. At its peak, in the 12th and 13th centuries, the city may have had a population of 750,000 people, possibly more. The famous temples, Angkor Wat, the Bayon, Ta Prohm, dozens of others, were only part of a vast urban landscape that included reservoirs, canals, roads, neighborhoods, markets, all supported by an elaborate hydraulic system that managed water during both the wet and dry seasons. The region experiences a monsoon climate, intense rains for part of the year, relative dryness for the rest. The Khmer engineers built enormous reservoirs, called barrays, to capture monsoon water and release it during the dry season, allowing multiple rice harvests per year. This water management system was the foundation of the empire's wealth and power. It allowed Angkor to support a huge population and to project military and cultural influence across mainland Southeast Asia. The temples were built by successive kings, each trying to surpass his predecessor. They were dedicated to Hindu and Buddhist deities, and they served both religious and political functions, demonstrating the king's piety and power, his connection to the divine, his ability to command vast resources of labor and materials. The inscriptions, carved in Sanskrit and Khmer, record the construction of temples, the dedication of lands and laborers to support them, the genealogies of royal families, the victories of armies. And then, in the 14th and 15th centuries, the system begins to break down. The inscriptions become less frequent. New temple construction slows and then stops. The hydraulic infrastructure shows signs of stress and failure. The population of Angkor declines. By the mid-15th century, the capital has been effectively abandoned, and the center of Khmer political power has shifted south toward Phnom Penh and the coast. What happened? Again, the answer is layered. Climate change is a major factor. Paleoclimate studies show that the 14th and 15th centuries were a period of unusual variability in monsoon patterns. Some years saw extreme rainfall, others severe drought. The hydraulic system at Angkor was designed for predictable seasonal patterns. It could handle normal monsoons, but when the patterns became erratic, the system struggled. Too much rain could damage canals and reservoirs. Flooding could wash out embankments and breach dikes. The water management network was vast and required constant maintenance. If parts of it failed, the effects could cascade through the system. A breached reservoir could flood downstream areas, destroy fields, displace populations, and repairing large-scale infrastructure required labor, resources, and centralized coordination. If the state was already under stress, repairs might be delayed or incomplete. Too little rain was equally problematic. The reservoirs were designed to store water for the dry season. If monsoons were weak, the reservoirs did not fill adequately. There would not be enough water for irrigation during the dry months. Rice yields would fall. The population that depended on multiple annual harvests could not be sustained. Recent research using LiDAR, laser mapping that can penetrate forest cover and reveal ground features, has shown that the hydraulic network at Angkor was even more extensive than previously thought. It covered hundreds of square kilometers with canals, embankments, and water control structures spread across a vast area. Maintaining such a system would have been an enormous undertaking. And the same LiDAR surveys have revealed evidence of water management failures, breached embankments, eroded canals, signs that the system was overwhelmed in its final decades. Environmental degradation also played a role. Centuries of intensive farming, deforestation to clear land and provide fuel, and urban expansion would have altered the local landscape. Soils could erode, watersheds could become less stable. The forest cover that once regulated water flow and protected soils was reduced. This would have made the region more vulnerable to both flooding and drought. Warfare and political instability compounded the environmental stress. The Khmer Empire faced military pressure from the Thai kingdoms to the west. The inscriptions record wars, shifting alliances, territorial losses. The capital, Angkor, was sacked by Thai armies in 1431, an event often cited as the end of the Angkorian period. But the decline had begun earlier. The sack of 1431 was a symptom, not a cause. The city was already weakened, its population reduced, its infrastructure failing, its political authority fragmentary. Trade patterns were also shifting. Maritime trade in Southeast Asia was becoming increasingly important in the 14th and 15th centuries. Ports on the coast offered access to global trade networks linking China, India, the Middle East, and beyond. Angkor, located inland, was less well-positioned to benefit from this trade. The coastal regions, which had once been peripheral to the inland empire, were becoming more economically and politically significant. The shift of the Khmer capital toward the coast, toward Phnom Penh, reflects this new reality. The empire adapted, but Angkor itself was left behind. Religion may also have played a subtle role. The later Khmer kings were increasingly Theravada Buddhist, a tradition that emphasized monastic life and personal spiritual development over the grand temple-building projects of earlier Hindu and Mahayana Buddhist kings. Theravada Buddhism, which spread across mainland Southeast Asia during this period, did not require the massive architectural investments that earlier religious traditions had. Kings could demonstrate piety by supporting monasteries and monks, rather than by building stone temples. This shift in religious ideology may have reduced the motivation to maintain and expand the temples at Angkor. The abandonment of Angkor was gradual. The temples were not destroyed, though some were damaged by weather and by the encroaching forest. The population did not vanish in a single event. People moved away over decades, seeking better conditions elsewhere, following the political center as it shifted south, adapting to new economic opportunities. By the 16th century, Angkor was a shadow of its former self, its great temples maintained by small communities of monks, but no longer the heart of an empire. The forest grew over the roads and reservoirs. The canals silted up. The bares, once filled with water, dried out or became overgrown. And the city, which had been built to last forever, slowly returned to the landscape. But the Khmer people endured. They adapted. The empire continued in a new form, centered on the coast, engaged with maritime trade networks, navigating a changing political landscape. Angkor was abandoned, but Khmer culture was not. The temples remained, silent witnesses to a different time, eventually rediscovered by French explorers in the 19th century and becoming symbols of Cambodian identity and heritage. The lesson of Angkor is similar to the lessons of the Bronze Age and the classic Maya. Complexity, especially complexity that depends on centralized infrastructure, is vulnerable. The hydraulic system at Angkor was an engineering marvel. It allowed the city to thrive for centuries, but it also made the city dependent on that system. When the system failed, the city could not adapt. It did not collapse overnight, but it could not maintain its population and its political centrality without the water management network that had supported it. And the failure of the system was not due to a single cause. It was environmental, political, economic, cultural, all at once. The monsoon patterns changed. The infrastructure decayed. Wars drained resources. Trade routes shifted. Religious practices evolved. Each factor alone might have been manageable. Together, they made continuation impossible, or at least not worthwhile. The costs of staying at Angkor exceeded the benefits, so people left. Let us now turn westward, to the Mediterranean once more, but to a different era, to the late Roman Empire, to the long, slow transformation of the western provinces between the 4th and 6th centuries of the Common Era, a period often called the Fall of Rome, though, as with our previous examples, the reality is more complex than a simple fall. Rome at its height in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE was the largest empire the ancient world had yet seen. It controlled territories stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine and Danube to the Sahara. The population of the empire may have exceeded 60 or 70 million people. The city of Rome itself held close to 1 million inhabitants, a level of urbanization that would not be seen again in Europe until the modern era. The empire had roads, aqueducts, ports, a common currency, a legal system, a standing army, a bureaucracy, and a shared culture that blended Roman, Greek, and local traditions. But by the 3rd century, the empire was under strain. Epidemic disease, possibly smallpox and measles, had reduced populations in the 2nd century. The Antonine Plague, which struck in the 160s and 170s, and the Plague of Cyprian in the 250s and 260s, killed significant percentages of the population, weakened military recruitment, disrupted agriculture and trade, and strained the treasury. The political system became unstable. The 3rd century saw frequent civil wars, short-lived emperors, and regional fragmentation. The frontiers came under increasing pressure from groups beyond the borders, Germanic tribes, Goths, Persians, and others. The empire adapted. It reformed. The Tetrarchy of Diocletian, the reign of Constantine, the division into Eastern and Western administrative units. These were attempts to stabilize the system, to make it more resilient. And in many ways, they succeeded. The eastern half of the empire, centered on Constantinople, would endure for another 1,000 years as the Byzantine Empire. But the western half, centered on Rome and later Ravenna, could not maintain its cohesion. The Western Roman Empire did not fall in a single event. The traditional date given is 476 CE, when the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by the Germanic general Odoacer But this was a formality. Real imperial authority in the West had been fragmenting for decades. By 476, much of the Western Empire was already under the control of various Germanic kingdoms. The Visigoths in Spain and southern Gaul, the Vandals in North Africa, the Burgundians in eastern Gaul, the Ostrogoths in Italy, the Franks in northern Gaul, the Angles and Saxons in Britain. These kingdoms were not hostile to Roman culture. Many of their rulers claimed Roman titles and saw themselves as continuing Roman traditions. But they were independent. They did not answer to the emperor. The empire had transformed into a patchwork of successor states. Why did this happen? Why did the West fragment while the East endured? Economic decline is a key factor. The Western provinces, though wealthy, were less urbanized and less economically integrated than the East. The East had the great cities of the ancient world: Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, dozens of others. It controlled the richest trade routes linking the Mediterranean with Asia. The West, by contrast, was more rural, more dependent on agriculture, and less able to generate the tax revenues needed to support a large army and bureaucracy. Taxation had always been the foundation of the empire. The army, which defended the frontiers and maintained internal order, was expensive. The bureaucracy, which administered laws and collected taxes, required payment. The infrastructure, roads, aqueducts, ports, needed maintenance. All of this depended on taxing agricultural production and trade. But taxation requires administrative capacity. You need officials to assess land, collect payments, prevent corruption, and enforce compliance. If the administration weakens, tax collection declines. And if tax collection declines, the state cannot pay its soldiers or officials, which further weakens the administration. A negative feedback loop. In the Western provinces during the 4th and 5th centuries, this loop accelerated. The military situation required more spending. Armies had to be maintained on the Rhine and Danube frontiers, in Gaul, in Spain, in North Africa, in Britain. But the tax base was shrinking. Population had declined due to epidemics and warfare. Trade was disrupted by insecurity. The wealthy landowners, who controlled much of the agricultural production, became more powerful and more able to resist taxation, while the poor, who had little to give, were squeezed harder, leading to rural depopulation as farmers abandoned their land to escape tax collectors. The army itself changed. Roman military recruitment had traditionally drawn from the empire's own population, supplemented by auxiliaries from allied or subject peoples. But by the 4th and 5th centuries, recruitment from within the empire was difficult. Population decline, economic stress, and declining civic commitment meant fewer Roman citizens were willing or able to serve. The state increasingly relied on hiring Germanic warriors, either as individuals or as entire groups, foederati, allied tribes who fought for Rome in exchange for land and payments. This was pragmatic, but it also meant that the army became less integrated, less loyal to the central state, and more responsive to its immediate commanders, who were often themselves Germanic. The sack of Rome by the Visigoths in 410 CE shocked the Roman world. Rome had not been successfully sacked in 800 years. The event was symbolic, a demonstration that the empire could no longer protect even its own capital. But the sack itself was brief, and the Visigoths soon moved on, eventually settling in southern Gaul and Spain. More significant was the underlying fact. The Western Empire could no longer field armies strong enough to defend its territories. The frontiers were porous. Groups moved across them, sometimes as invaders, sometimes as refugees, sometimes as invited allies. Britain was abandoned. By the early 5th century, Roman military and administrative presence in Britain had ended. The province was left to defend itself. Local Romano-British populations struggled to maintain order. Germanic groups, Angles, Saxons, Jutes, began settling in the east, invited or simply arriving, taking land, establishing their own kingdoms. The Romano-British culture fragmented. Latin literacy declined. The villa economy collapsed. Towns shrank. Over the course of the 5th and 6th centuries, Britain transformed from a Roman province into a collection of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, with Romano-British populations pushed to the western and northern fringes. In Gaul, the process was different, but the outcome similar. The Roman administrative structure weakened, but it did not disappear entirely. Germanic groups, particularly the Franks, established control over much of the region. But the Frankish kings adopted many Roman practices. They worked with the existing Gallo-Roman aristocracy. They maintained Latin as the language of administration, at least initially. They converted to Christianity, aligning themselves with the Roman Church and the cultural legacy of Rome. The transformation here was more gradual, a blending rather than a sharp break. In North Africa, the Vandals established a kingdom centered on Carthage. They controlled the wealthy grain-producing regions that had once fed Rome. The loss of North Africa to the Western Empire was economically devastating. The grain supply was cut off. The western provinces, already struggling, lost access to critical resources. The Vandal kingdom was relatively stable for several decades, though it was eventually reconquered by the Byzantine Empire in the 6th century. In Italy, the situation was complex. The Western emperors continued to rule, in name, from Ravenna. But real power often lay with military commanders, many of whom were Germanic. Odoacer, who deposed the last emperor in 476, did not claim the imperial title for himself. He ruled as King of Italy, nominally acknowledging the Eastern Emperor in Constantinople. Later, the Ostrogothic king Theodoric established a kingdom in Italy that self-consciously preserved Roman institutions and culture. Theodoric saw himself as a Roman king, ruling Romans, maintaining Roman law and Roman traditions. But he was not the emperor. The Western Empire was gone. Urban life declined across the western provinces. Not everywhere, not uniformly, but the trend was clear. Cities shrank, public buildings fell into disrepair, aqueducts were not maintained, amphitheaters and baths were abandoned or converted to other uses. Markets became smaller, less diverse. The coinage system, which had been standardized across the empire, fragmented. Different regions issued their own coins, often of lower quality. Long-distance trade declined. The Mediterranean, once a Roman lake, became contested and dangerous. Piracy increased. Trade routes contracted. Literacy declined. Latin continued to be used, especially by the church, but the widespread literacy of the Roman period faded. The schools that had trained administrators, lawyers, and rhetoricians closed or became rare. Fewer people could read. Fewer texts were copied. Libraries were lost. The corpus of Roman literature that survives today is only a fraction of what once existed, and much of what survives does so because it was preserved in monasteries during the early medieval period. But again, this was transformation, not erasure. The Roman Empire in the West did not end in fire and blood. It gradually dissolved into successor kingdoms that retained elements of Roman culture while also bringing new traditions. Latin evolved into the Romance languages. Roman law influenced medieval legal systems. The Christian Church, which had become the official religion of the empire in the 4th century, survived and thrived, becoming the primary preserver of Roman knowledge and the most powerful institution in medieval Europe. The physical infrastructure, roads, bridges, aqueducts, city walls. Many of these structures remained, even if they were no longer maintained to Roman standards. The people did not vanish. The population of the former Western Empire continued to live, farm, trade, and worship. They spoke evolving forms of Latin or adopted Germanic languages. They blended Roman and Germanic customs. They adapted to new political realities, and over time, new forms of complexity emerged. The Carolingian Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, the medieval kingdoms of England, France, and Spain. These were not simply continuations of Rome, but they built on Roman foundations. The fall of Rome teaches us that even the largest, most powerful, most enduring systems are not permanent. Rome had lasted for centuries. It had weathered crises before. It had reformed, adapted, rebuilt. But by the 5th century, the pressures were too many, too sustained. Epidemic disease, economic decline, military pressure, administrative breakdown, political fragmentation, each fed the others, and the western provinces, less wealthy and less integrated than the East, could not maintain the systems that had held the empire together. Let us now turn to South America, to the highlands of the Andes, to the great ceremonial centers of Tiwanaku and Wari, two powerful polities that shaped the Andean world for centuries before both experienced profound transformations around the year 1000 of the Common Era. Tiwanaku was located near the southern shore of Lake Titicaca, in what is now Bolivia, at an altitude of nearly 4,000 meters above sea level. This is one of the highest urban centers ever built, a city that existed in a harsh environment where crops grew slowly and oxygen was thin. Yet Tiwanaku thrived for over 700 years, from roughly 300 to 1000 CE. At its peak, the core city may have held tens of thousands of people, with a much larger population scattered across the surrounding region. The site is dominated by monumental stone architecture. The Akapana Pyramid, a massive stepped platform, the Kalasasaya, a sunken court lined with standing stones. The Gateway of the Sun, a single block of andesite carved with intricate iconography. These structures were not merely ceremonial. They were statements of power, demonstrations of the state's ability to quarry, transport, and carve stone blocks weighing many tons, often brought from quarries dozens of kilometers away. Tiwanaku was the center of a complex political and economic system. It controlled agricultural lands around Lake Titicaca, using raised field systems to manage water and frost, allowing cultivation in an environment where most crops would fail. It controlled trade routes that connected the high plateau with the Pacific coast and the Amazon lowlands. It produced distinctive pottery, textiles, and metalwork that spread across a vast region, found in graves and settlements hundreds of kilometers from the capital. This spread of Tiwanaku material culture suggests trade, religious influence, or political control. The archaeological record cannot always distinguish between them. To the north, in the highlands of what is now Peru, the Wari polity emerged around the same time. Wari was more overtly imperial than Tiwanaku. It built administrative centers across a large territory, established roads, constructed storage facilities for surplus goods, and imposed architectural and ceramic styles across the regions it controlled. The Wari capital, near modern Ayacucho, was densely built, with multi-story compounds, plazas, and evidence of craft production on a large scale. The city may have held 40,000 people or more. Wari and Tiwanaku shared certain iconographic elements, particularly the staff god, a figure that appears on pottery, textiles, and stone carvings in both cultures. Some scholars suggest that Tiwanaku was a religious center whose ideology spread widely, while Wari was a more militaristic state that adopted Tiwanaku religious imagery to legitimize its own authority. The relationship between the two polities remains debated. They were contemporaries, They influenced each other, but whether they were allies, rivals, or something more complex is unclear. Both Tiwanaku and Wari experienced collapse or profound transformation around 1000 CE. The monumental construction at Tiwanaku ceased. The city was gradually abandoned. The raised field agricultural systems fell out of use. The regional population declined. Wari's administrative centers were abandoned around the same time. The road network fell into disrepair. The distinctive Wari ceramic styles disappeared. The political unity that Wari had imposed fragmented into smaller, regional chiefdoms. Why did both of these powerful Andean states decline at the same time? Climate change is, once again, a leading explanation. Paleoclimate data from ice cores in the Andes shows evidence of a severe, prolonged drought between roughly 1000 and 1100 CE. Lake Titicaca's water levels dropped significantly. The glaciers that fed the lake and the surrounding rivers retreated. The raised field systems that Tiwanaku depended on required careful water management. They worked by creating alternating raised beds and canals. Water in the canals absorbed heat during the day and released it at night, protecting crops from frost. Aquatic plants in the canals could be harvested and used as fertilizer. But the system depended on adequate water. If the lake level dropped and the rivers slowed, the raised fields could not function effectively. A drought would have reduced agricultural productivity across the entire Titicaca Basin. Tiwanaku's population depended on the surplus produced by these fields. If yields fell, the city could not be sustained. The non-farming population, the administrators, priests, artisans, and laborers who built the monuments, all depended on farmers producing more than they needed for themselves. When that surplus declined, the system unraveled. For Wari, the effects of drought would have been different but equally serious. Wari controlled territories that ranged from coastal valleys to highland plateaus. Different regions had different climatic conditions. A drought in the highlands might not affect the coast as severely, or vice versa. But Wari's power depended on its ability to coordinate these regions, to move goods and people across its road network, to store surplus in administrative centers and redistribute it as needed. If agricultural production declined across multiple regions simultaneously, or if the administrative capacity to manage redistribution weakened, the system could collapse. There is also evidence of political instability during Wari's final phase. Some sites show signs of destruction or rapid abandonment. Others show evidence of reduced administrative presence, fewer storage facilities in use, less standardization in pottery and architecture. This suggests that central authority was weakening, that the provinces were becoming more independent, that the integration that had defined the Wari state was breaking down. Environmental degradation may have played a role in both cases. Centuries of intensive agriculture, deforestation for fuel and construction, and the pressure of large populations on fragile highland ecosystems could have reduced the land's productivity. When drought arrived, degraded landscapes were less resilient. Erosion would have been worse. Soils would have lost fertility more quickly. Recovery would have been slower. There is also the possibility of social and ideological factors. Both Tiwanaku and Wari were deeply invested in monumental architecture and elaborate ritual systems. The construction of temples, pyramids, and administrative centers required enormous labor inputs. The rituals performed at these sites were meant to ensure cosmic order, agricultural fertility, and political legitimacy. But if droughts persisted despite these rituals, if the gods seemed unresponsive, if the sacrifices and ceremonies did not bring rain, then the ideological foundations of authority could be questioned. Populations might lose faith in the elite's ability to mediate between the human and divine worlds, and without that ideological legitimacy, the elite's power would erode. The abandonment of Tiwanaku was not immediate. People continued to live in the region, but they no longer built monuments or maintained the raised field systems. Settlement patterns shifted. People moved to higher elevations or dispersed into smaller communities. The city itself, the ceremonial core, was left to the elements. Wind and rain eroded the adobe portions of the structures. Stones were sometimes removed and repurposed by later populations. But the great monolithic gateways and carved stones remained, silent markers of a vanished order. Wari's collapse led to political fragmentation. The provinces that had been integrated under Wari rule became independent chiefdoms. These chiefdoms continued many Wari cultural traditions, but they were smaller, less centralized, less capable of large-scale organization. Warfare among these chiefdoms appears to have increased. Settlement patterns show more fortified hilltop sites, suggesting insecurity. This period, sometimes called the Late Intermediate Period in Andean archaeology, was a time of regionalization, of local identities reasserting themselves after centuries of imperial domination. Eventually, new forms of complexity would emerge. The Inca Empire, which rose in the 15th century, would reunify much of the Andean region under a single political system, larger and more centralized, even than Wari. The Inca built on the foundations of earlier states, using similar road networks, similar agricultural techniques, similar administrative strategies. But between Wari and the Inca, there was a gap of several centuries, a time of smaller polities and regional diversity. The Andean case, like the others we have examined, shows that collapse is often transformation. Tiwanaku and Wari did not leave behind empty landscapes. They left behind populations who adapted, who continued cultural traditions, who reorganized into new political forms. The monumental architecture was abandoned, but the people endured. Now, let us step back and consider the patterns we have observed across these different cases. What do they have in common? What do they teach us about how complex societies change, decline, or transform? First, collapse is rarely sudden. The popular image of cities burning overnight, populations fleeing in panic, is usually inaccurate. Instead, we see gradual processes unfolding over decades or generations. Construction slows, then stops. Trade goods become less common. Writing becomes less frequent. Populations thin. The elite leave. The administration weakens. The craftspeople find other work. The farmers stay or move depending on local conditions. The process is often invisible to those living through it. A series of small adjustments that only in retrospect appear as collapse. Second, collapse often begins at the top. The most complex, most centralized institutions are the most vulnerable. Writing systems disappear because scribes lose their employment when palaces can no longer pay them. Monumental construction ceases because there is no longer surplus to fund it. Long-distance trade declines because the merchant networks depend on stable political conditions that no longer exist. But everyday life, farming, family, local community, this continues. The peasant is more resilient than the palace. Third, networks create both strength and vulnerability. The Bronze Age Mediterranean, the classic Maya, Angkor, Rome, Tiwanaku, and Wari. All of these were network societies. They depended on connections, on trade, on the movement of goods, people, and ideas across distances. These networks made them wealthy and powerful. But networks are fragile. They require maintenance, security, trust. When networks break down, due to warfare, piracy, political instability, or simply the cost of maintenance exceeding the benefits, societies lose access to the resources that supported their complexity. Fourth, environmental stress is a recurring factor. Climate change appears in almost every case we have examined. Not always the same kind of change, sometimes drought, sometimes flooding, sometimes erratic variability, but almost always present. This is not surprising. Complex societies depend on agriculture. Agriculture depends on climate. When climate shifts unfavorably, agricultural yields decline. And when agricultural yields decline, everything else is affected. Food storage, trade, taxation, labor availability, political stability, all of these depend on surplus. When surplus disappears, the system is stressed. Fifth, multiple pressures arrive together. No single factor explains collapse. It is always a combination. Climate stress and warfare, environmental degradation and disease, economic decline and political fragmentation. The pressures compound, creating feedback loops. A drought reduces harvests, which reduces tax revenues, which weakens the military, which makes borders less secure, which disrupts trade, which reduces economic activity, which further reduces tax revenues. Breaking these loops requires resources and centralized coordination, the very things that are disappearing. Sixth, adaptation is always happening. Societies do not simply collapse and vanish. They adapt, they simplify, they reorganize. Sometimes the adaptation is successful, and the society survives in a new form. Sometimes the adaptation involves migration, populations moving to regions with better conditions. Sometimes the adaptation is local, villages maintaining themselves even as the cities and palaces disappear. The archaeological record often shows continuity at the local level even when the regional or imperial level collapses. Seventh, collapse can create opportunities. The fall of the Bronze Age palaces was followed by the Iron Age and the rise of new political forms, Greek city-states, Phoenician merchant networks, new empires. The Maya collapse in the south was accompanied by continued flourishing in the north and the eventual rise of new Maya states. The fall of Rome led to the medieval kingdoms that would eventually become modern European nations. Wari's collapse allowed regional diversity to flourish before the Inca unified the Andes again. Collapse clears the board. It removes old structures and allows new ones to emerge. Eighth, memory fades but does not disappear. The Bronze Age palaces became the backdrop for Greek epic poetry, the Iliad and Odyssey, stories set in a lost age of heroes. The classic Maya were remembered in oral tradition and later revived as symbols of Mesoamerican heritage. Angkor became a legendary city in Cambodian memory, rediscovered and reclaimed as a national symbol. Rome's legacy shaped all of medieval Europe and continues to shape the world today. Tiwanaku and Wari influenced later Andean states, including the Inca. The societies that collapsed did not vanish from memory. They were transformed into stories, symbols, foundations for later identities. Let us now consider the everyday experience of collapse. What was it like to live through these transformations? Imagine you are a farmer in the Maya lowlands in the year 850. You have heard that the great city to the south, the one with the tall pyramids, has stopped holding the ceremonies. The king has not been seen in months. Traders say the scribes have left, gone north or into the hills. You do not know why. Perhaps the gods are displeased. Perhaps the rains were too few. Perhaps the wars consumed too much. It does not matter to you directly. You still plant maize. You still harvest beans and squash. Your family still eats. But the marketplace in the city is quieter now. There are fewer goods, less variety. The officials who used to collect tribute have not come this season. Is that good? It means you keep more of your harvest, but it also means there is no one to organize repairs on the reservoir, no one to settle disputes between villages, no one to defend against raids from rival groups. The old order is fading, and what will replace it is uncertain. Or imagine you are a merchant in the eastern Mediterranean in the year 1190 BCE. For generations, your family has traded grain and olive oil, carrying goods between coastal cities, paying tariffs to palace authorities, relying on treaties and agreements that kept the sea routes safe. But now, there are reports of ships attacked, cities burned, refugees fleeing overland. The palace at Pylos has sent word that it needs grain urgently, that it will pay well, but the payment is in goods, not in the bronze or silver you prefer, because coinage is scarce and the metal supply is uncertain. You consider the risk. The voyage could be profitable, or you could lose everything to pirates or storms. You decide to stay in port this season, to wait and see. Others make the same decision. And so the trade network, which depends on the aggregate decisions of many individuals, contracts a little more. Or imagine you are a scribe in a Roman provincial town in Gaul in the year 450. You were trained in Latin, in rhetoric, in law. You served the local magistrate, drafting documents, recording proceedings, maintaining archives. But the magistrate is old now, and there is no money to pay you regularly. The taxes that once funded the administration are collected sporadically, if at all. The wealthiest families pay what they choose, and there is no one to compel them. The soldiers who once garrisoned the nearby fort have left or been reassigned. The roads are less safe. Trade has declined. The town's forum, which once bustled with activity, is quiet. You have begun teaching the sons of the wealthy landowners, a private arrangement, less prestigious than your old position but more reliable. You worry that your own son will not have the same opportunities you did, that the world of letters and law you trained for is fading. You are not wrong. Or imagine you are a priest at Tiwanaku in the year 1050. The rains have been poor for many years now. The lake level is lower than the old markers indicate. The raised fields are not producing as they once did. Fewer people come to the city for the festivals. The offerings brought by pilgrims are smaller, less valuable. The workshops that produce the fine pottery and textiles are less active. Some of the craftspeople have left, gone to villages where they have family, where they can farm if necessary. The ruling council meets less frequently. There are arguments about what to do, about whether to move the capital, about whether the rituals are being performed correctly, about whether the gods have abandoned the people or the people have abandoned the gods. You perform your duties, but you sense that something fundamental has changed, that the city's time is ending. These are the human experiences of collapse. Not dramatic, not apocalyptic, but uncertain, anxious, adaptive. People making decisions with incomplete information, trying to navigate a world that is becoming less predictable. The structures they relied on, political authority, trade networks, social hierarchies, are weakening. But life continues. They plant crops, raise children, maintain homes, practice their beliefs. They adapt to new circumstances. They find new patrons, new markets, new leaders, or they move, seeking better conditions elsewhere. Collapse from the inside is often not recognized as collapse. It is simply a difficult time, a period of transition, a series of challenges. Only later, when scribes and historians look back, does the pattern become clear, does the transformation acquire a name. Let us turn now to a question that haunts all of these stories. Could collapse have been prevented? If the people at the time had understood the pressures building around them, could they have adapted in time to avoid the worst outcomes? Perhaps. In some cases. If the droughts in the Maya lowlands or the Titicaca basin had been shorter, or if they had arrived at a different time when societies were not already stressed by other factors, adaptation might have been easier. If the Bronze Age kingdoms had found alternative sources of tin, or if they had shifted to iron earlier, the trade disruptions might have been less catastrophic. If the Western Roman Empire had found a way to maintain tax revenues, or if it had integrated Germanic groups more successfully, the administrative collapse might have been avoided. But adaptation requires flexibility, resources, and political will. And complex societies are often rigid. They have invested heavily in particular ways of doing things, in particular technologies, in particular social structures. Changing those investments is difficult. Elites resist changes that threaten their status. Populations resist changes that disrupt their livelihoods. Religious ideologies sanctify certain practices, making them difficult to question. And institutions, once established, develop their own momentum, their own interests in self-perpetuation. Moreover, the information available to decision-makers at the time was limited. They did not have climate data. They did not know that a drought was part of a longer-term pattern rather than an isolated event. They did not know that trade disruptions in one region were connected to disruptions elsewhere. They made decisions based on immediate concerns, on local knowledge, on cultural assumptions. And often, those decisions made sense in the short term, but proved disastrous in the long term. There is also the problem of collective action. Even if some individuals or groups recognize the need for change, implementing that change required coordination across many actors: farmers, merchants, officials, priests, soldiers. Coordinating collective action is difficult even in stable times. In times of crisis, when trust is eroding and institutions are weakening, it becomes nearly impossible. So perhaps collapse could not have been prevented, not completely. But perhaps it could have been managed differently. Perhaps the transitions could have been less severe, the suffering less widespread, the loss of knowledge less profound. This is the haunting question that remains. Let us now consider what these patterns mean for us today. We live in a complex, interconnected world. Our societies depend on global trade networks, on stable climates, on centralized infrastructures for energy, water, food, communication. We have built systems of remarkable sophistication. We can communicate instantly across the planet. We can transport goods from one continent to another in days. We can store and process information at scales unimaginable to previous generations, but we are also vulnerable. Our networks, like those of the past, create dependencies. We rely on supply chains that stretch across the world. We depend on stable climates for agriculture. We depend on political and economic systems that are themselves under stress from inequality, environmental change, and shifting power dynamics. The patterns we have observed, climate stress, resource competition, network fragility, political instability, disease, are not merely historical curiosities. They are recurring features of complex societies, and the fact that they have caused transformations and collapses in the past suggests they could do so again. But there is also reason for hope. Unlike the people of the past, we have knowledge, we have climate data, we have historical precedents, we can model possible futures. We can, in principle, make collective decisions to reduce vulnerabilities, to build resilience, to adapt before crises become catastrophic. Whether we will do so is an open question. History suggests that societies often do not act until forced to, that short-term interests override long-term planning, that the inertia of established systems is difficult to overcome. But history also shows that people are remarkably adaptable, that even in the face of collapse, they find ways to survive, to reorganize, to build anew. The story of collapse is not a story of endings, it is a story of transformations. Societies change shape, they simplify, they reorganize. The people endure. And eventually, new forms of complexity emerge, learning from the past, adapting to new conditions, building on the ruins of what came before. The great collapses of the past were not moments when civilizations vanished. They were moments when civilizations transformed, when the systems that had defined them for generations ceased to function, and when new systems, slowly, painfully, began to take their place. The lights did not go out all at once. They dimmed slowly over generations, in different places, for different reasons, yet somehow at the same time. And in the darkness, people waited, adapted, and eventually built new lights. Tonight, we have walked through those moments of transformation. We have seen the Bronze Age palaces fall silent. We have watched the Maya cities empty. We have followed the slow retreat from Angkor. We have traced the fragmentation of Rome. We have stood at Tiwanaku as the raised fields dried and the ceremonies ended. We have asked what happens when the systems that hold civilizations together begin to unravel. And the answer, always, is that life continues. Changed, diminished perhaps in complexity, but continuous. The farmers plant. The children grow. The stories are told and retold, passed down through generations, transformed into legend, into myth, into the foundation for new identities. The ruins remain, stone and pottery, fragments of text, layers in the earth. They tell us that nothing is permanent, that even the greatest empires, the most impressive cities, the most sophisticated systems, can fade. But they also tell us that people endure, that adaptation is always happening, that transformation, though painful, is also renewal. The plaza is silent now, the stones still warm from the afternoon sun. The crowds are gone. The vendors have packed up their goods. The officials no longer wear their regalia, but somewhere nearby in a village or a valley, life continues. Quieter, simpler, but continuous. And the night feels a little wider, a little less contained by walls and torches. The stars are visible, the same stars that shone on the palace builders, the scribes, the merchants, the farmers. The same stars that will shine on whatever comes next. The great collapse was never one moment. It was many moments, many choices, many small pressures aligning. And the great transformation that followed was not an ending, but a beginning, a slow rebuilding, a gradual emergence of new forms from the ruins of the old. This is the pattern. This is the cycle. This is the quiet truth hidden in the silent stones and empty plazas of the ancient world. Complexity builds. Networks grow. Systems become elaborate, interconnected, dependent. And then, when the pressures align, when the climate shifts, or the trade routes close, or the armies drain the treasury, or the diseases thin the population, the complexity unravels. Not all at once, not everywhere the same way, but gradually, inexorably, the lights dim, and in the darkness, we wait, we adapt, we endure, and eventually, we build new lights.